Всем здравствуйте.
So good morning everyone. Now we are going to check the sound. The sound is going. Great. Hello everyone. We would like to say that we have many modes of translation, and if you need a translation you can take the equipment, you can take the headsets and use them. My name is Luda Uchkova. Good morning to everyone. My colleagues Maria Cristina and Ivan Sorokin will take the floor too a bit later. Good morning to everyone at the broadcasting online. So you are at the conference of Museum of Feelings 0+, which is starting today here at the wonderful Republican Children Library of Uzbekistan, the Museum of Feelings. This is the project of the Museum of Contemporary Art Garage, and here I'm moving to my hometown, to Moscow, and the conference of Feelings, it has always responded to three main questions. First question is what we do in the field of inclusion among the professional community, how we can share the information with each other, and where we are going and where we are moving in this field. It has always been international, and this year it is international too, and it's very valuable for us, and again we're grateful to the library for this. And this year conference is dedicated to the work with the children and the teenagers in the inclusive field, and it's really pleasant for us to be working here at the library, at the space for having this conference. It will last for 3 days. Today, as I said, is our first day, and I would like to say too that despite standing here, three of us, but to organize the conference, two institutions were participating, the Garage Museum, the Fund of Culture, and the library, so it's three in total, and there's a huge organizing team, and I'm very much grateful to those employees, 14 employees of Garage Museum, and the our translators to the sign language, and our simultaneous interpreters. So this is a huge project which is really inclusive, where we try to agree with each other. We're meeting in person and online. So this was really important to mention. And going back to the conference itself, and I think that especially those who do not speak Uzbek, they were thinking on what is written on our badge, what is written here on our screen. In Russian, it sounds like a nice time to chat. This is the work at the workshop of the which is called Lustra. This is the problem of the people with mental disorders, in which the people are working with the graphics in illustration, and this was the process where they first came to train and to learn different techniques, and later they became our co-partners and core participants. In part of that museum started making the different products for the merchandise, for advertising, and etc. And the participants, they became our contributors, and they're making huge contribution to our joint efforts. So I found this the answer to this riddle, that it's a nice time to chat, and I hope that it will be the same. So thank you very much for being here, and now I'm giving the floor to my colleague Maria, to our wonderful methodology specialist. She's going to talk about the main ideas of our event, and I hope it will be a nice time to chat. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'm really happy to see you all. About the technical part, and the part that's related to what we have within these 3 days. First of all, the conference is lasting within 3 days. The first 2 days is the professional agenda, where in the format of lectures and discussions, we are discussing with the professional community those things that we can do, what we can do. We are discussing the tools that we can use. And the third day, we will have the family and kids program, and for all of those who prefer can go through registration and join the work at the pottery equipment. So this is a very nice agenda, and you can look at this at the website of the library and the website of the Garage Museum. So about the professional block that we have today is divided into 4 parts. The first block is quite small. We are starting with 8. We are going to talk about the Soviet informal and formal pedagogical practices, about teaching of children with disabilities and how it influences the education, and what is the trace of the Soviet practices that we are finding here. In addition to that, we are going to have the lecture program. We also prepared the small research, research that is presented at the entrance to the library, at the small exhibition, and we have the excursion time at the agenda, and you can use this time to have a look. The space of the library is not so big, that's why we decided to do this at the same time, going together with the general agenda. And later we will talk about the exhibition and about the influence of the Soviet practices on modern times. The second block, it will start from 12:30. We are going to talk about the methods and approaches of the informal pedagogy. We decided to look at it with a quite broad view, and we are going to talk about this. Later, we will go to the topic of representation of diversity in the children and teenagers project, and later we will have the full day of showcases, where we are going to talk about different projects which are already implemented and how the organizers approach these projects, which tools they use, and we will have the toolkit for all those who want to replicate these activities in their institution. So that's how our agenda is going to look like. About the interpretation, please see that our conference is in 4 languages. Also, we have the interpretation to the international signs. If you need the simultaneous interpretation, you can take the headsets at the entrance when we're going to have the lectures. They will be in English, Russian, and Uzbek. Today they will be only Russian and English. Tomorrow they will be in Uzbek, and also at the Russian sign language. So please pay attention to having the headsets. The badges, we ask everyone to wear the badges. It's important because the library is working these days. It's open for the visitors. It's important so that we can distinct each other from the visitors. Please remember wearing the badges, and the access to the lunch and to coffee breaks only through badges. Those who are wearing our badges according to the colors of our conference should be united through these badges. What else I needed to say? And the last comment, and after I will give the floor to Ivan, we are opening our conference. We will have a small minor break, technical break, to see how the first lecture is going to take. We're asking our operator to put on the poster in YouTube, after which we will officially start our lecture program. With this, I'm giving the floor to Ivan. My name is Ivan Sorokin. I'm the curator of the Children Library, and I would like to give a couple of words about the library and say why we are here today. Our library has been reopened after reconstruction last year in September. And when we were planning the library, when we were thinking about it, we understood that this will be the open and comfortable space for everyone with the emotionally in-barrier environment. And last year we had a meeting with Luda. We discussed the prospects of conference for the next year, and we planned that the conference, if everything will go fine, we will have it here. For this, we are very much grateful to Garage, to the Fund of Development of Art and Culture of Uzbekistan. We thank Yandex. Not to take too much time, I'm very pleased to see you all here. I wish you all of the success with having our conference. So we will have a small technical pause. Here I will comment as all the speakers of today are here. Please always speak to the microphone if you need to speak.
All right, we're getting back. Now I want to make sure that we have our streaming back. Do we have streaming on place? Okay. Now let's move to our business program. Our first speaker is Maria Galmarini. She is associate professor of Williamsburg University. I want to give floor to Maria. She will be speaking English. We are starting.
Здравствуйте. Слышно? Да? Большое спасибо гаражу.
Thank you so much, Garage, and the library, and all stakeholders and visitors. I'm doing my presentation in English, but if you have any questions for me, I can answer in any language except from Uzbek. Когда меня
talk here, I was absolutely thrilled to participate in this work. To work with children with all sorts of disabilities, physical, mental, psychological, and teenagers as well.
Hamma garaj qoladigan narsalar judayam chiroyli. Mening mavzuyim judayam spetsifik hisoblanadi va men ba'zi material o'zimning tarixiy tadqiqotimdan materiallarim bilan siz bilan bo'lishaman va umid qilamanki bu leksiyadan olingan ma'lumotlar sizlarga yetarli bo'ladi. Demak, Sovet Ittifoqi 91-yildan keyin ko'p joylarda delegitimizatsiya qilingan, chunki sotsial stabillik va boylik u paytda maqtanilmagan va bu agentstvalar teskari qabul qilingan, chunki o'sha hamma organizatsiyalar bu yerda kontrol ustida qurilgan muammolar deb o'ylaganmiz va o'sha inkluzivlik Sovet davrida bo'lmagan degan xulosaga kelganmiz. Historiografiya va publik va integratsiya bo'yicha debatlar o'sha paytda bo'layotgan va integratsiya va inklyuziyalardan keyin bu narsalar bo'lgan.
Union, I want to focus on two of these progressive examples. One pertaining to the care of so-called morally defective children in the 1920s, and the other concerning iterational debates on mainstreaming versus segregation in the education of blind and low-sighted children. In presenting both examples, I will discuss their potential for advancing inclusion as well as their limitations. And then you will decide by yourself if and how these examples can inspire you today. Before getting into these two examples, let me briefly explain how the Soviet system of defectological re-education and child welfare was set up. Okay, it works. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union had developed a centralized state system of schooling, which made special education available to all disabled children as a basic right. It was entirely funded from the public purse, and it was based on defectology's scientific pedagogical principles. So here I give you a breakdown of how it all started. Under the jurisdiction of the Commissariat of Social Assistance, categories of children such as morally defective children, mentally retarded, that's the terminology of the time, of course, right? And blind, deaf, and physically defective children were taken care of. But this system very soon was replaced by this other system, whereby various commissariats were taking care of different types of children. So the Commissariat of Education, as you can see, as well as the Commissariat of Health, the Commissariat of Social Assistance, but also other agencies, such as the Political Police Agency. And this system was in place until 1935, when it changed again. Let me quickly go through this slide. It changed again and became a much more controlling system with a larger influence of the Commissariat of Internal Affairs. But this basic structure remained in place really until 1991 as a structure, as an administrative structure. I'd be happy to talk more about that when we have a question section, but now I want to start with something I think more interesting than this. And that's the history of the medico-pedagogical station and the children who lived in it. The medico-pedagogical station was a model home and re-education center for so-called morally defective children of the Union's capital. In documents from the early 1920s, it was advertised as a completely new institution, but in fact it had inherited the territory, the buildings, the furniture, the staff of a former school sanatorium for nervous children, which you see portrayed in the picture here. Between 1908 and 1917, this school sanatorium was privately funded and administered by a child psychiatry called Vsevolod Petrovich Tashkent. Thanks to the Commissariat of Education's generous support and sponsorship, a massive restoration program in the fall of 1919 turned the building that I just showed you into a much larger structure. It was a complex that included a museum of child defectiveness, a clinic for outpatient services, and a system of 9 pavilions for the care of between 15 and 20 children. So who were these children? These children who were called morally defective. One of them, whose story has left traces in the historical record, was a so-called psychoneurotic girl called Nastya. Born in 1906, Nastya had led a happy, materially comfortable life until 1913, when at the age of 7, she became an orphan and moved into the house of an aunt. It was at that point that she began to be increasingly different from her peers. She appeared to her aunt as difficult to raise. Unable or unwilling to take care of her troubled orphan niece, the aunt took Nastya to the medico-pedagogical station. And I want to show you a picture of what this station looks like today. Today is no longer a medico-pedagogical station. I'm having trouble with the clicker. Here you go. Today, it has been completely redone after a fire burned it down in the mid-30s, but it still hosts an Institute of Defectology in Moscow. It's Pagodinskaya ulica 8. There, Nastya was diagnosed with moral defectiveness, a diagnosis of the time. And she was required to join a group of 16 boys, all boys, with so-called psychological psyches and personality defects, who had also been admitted there for rehabilitation. According to the defectologist Murashov, when Nastya and the other children first walked into the busy streets along the Moscow River into the station and the large parks of conifers of this station, this is a quote, they immediately felt as though they were leaving the noise of the city behind the gates. We don't know actually how Nastya felt the day she entered the medico-pedagogical station for the first time. But a series of poems she wrote later, when she was in this institution, revealed that she was not so happy and so peaceful as Murashov thought she should feel under his benevolent care. In a poem that I want to show you that Nastya wrote, a poem entitled Grustne dumy, Sad Thoughts, she thus wrote, yes, I must suffer for a long time. Still 6 years have to go by, and then the heart will resound with joy when their end will come. Then I will go to my dear town, to be a teacher there, and there, with all my energy, I will love Varia and Iretska. I will often work there and eat the bread of my labor. Then the scolds of a sick soul I will no longer fear. So the repetition of the word there indicates that Nastya didn't locate happiness in the medico-pedagogical station, but rather projected happiness into a different space and time. She hoped to accomplish a speedy re-education through her conscientious work and leave the defectologist institution as soon as possible. Her dream was to go back to her hometown, find a job, enjoy the love of her siblings, Varya and Irachka. Working and loving her family, Nastya would have rejoined the normal so-called life that all the other members of the nation's Soviet society supposedly were living. She would no longer feel remorse for her defective morality, but would rather become an acceptable Soviet subject. As it turned out, Nastya was a good patient. Upon completion of her re-education, she left the defectological facility and sought to build her happiness by working in a local library. The doctor who had cured her took pride in her accomplishments, and he wrote, "I was able to completely correct her neurasthenic personality. Of course, some neurasthenic traits remained, but still I was able to make Nastya socially fit." This was Murashov. Like him, a PERM defectologist, Jean Genrikovich Putnin, emphasized that the whole environment in his psychoneurological school sanatorium was set up to protect psychic and physical health of the children. However, in their letters home, his young patients expressed quite different feelings. Nikolai Kivkin and Boris Bogatov, for instance, wrote that they were provided with enough food, they were provided warm clothes, but this was not sufficient to make them happy. They wanted to go home, and they threatened to run away if their mothers didn't come to rescue them. Indeed, Boris, Nikolai, and 11 more children attempted to escape from Putinin's school sanatorium in 1927-1928. Most of them were caught by the defectologists before they could go too far. A few children made it back home, but were soon unceremoniously shipped back to Putin by parents that had little patience with their moral defects. As the father of 10-year-old Stanislav Akloto claimed when his son ran back home, Stanislav has a propensity for vagrancy and has run away from home already several times, disappearing for weeks or even months. Don't send him back. Send him to some special therapy or to a home for defective children. So these stories dramatize all the ambiguity of the defectologist's practice. They reveal that in practice, the idea of a hard-working and loving family and the vision of a healthy environment didn't always nurture joy in the children themselves. As a modern humane science of help, defectology had the enlightened mission of transforming defective youth from suffering, deviant subjects into corrected, socially useful member of the new proletarian family. Yet this science didn't guarantee children's well-being in the process. Now, one of the reasons why Nastya, for instance, didn't like the medico-pedagogical station was probably the surveillance to which its young residents were constantly subjected. Upon admission to the station, all children underwent an initial diagnostic evaluation of medical and psychological nature. Everything in them was scrupulously searched for defects, and then defects were found, of course. Their entire bodies, their past experiences and prevent behaviors, intellectual development, verbal skills, artistic abilities, their moods, their wishes, their emotions, their worries, their phobias, their interests, their social skills, their ethical outlook, their sense of aesthetics. So examinations, observations continued throughout the children's stay in the medico-pedagogical station. Every day, the defectologists registered their comments on the children's psyche in their clinical journals. Anthropometrical measurements and photographs, interviews with the parents, pedagogical remarks were regularly made. Finally, a report on their psychophysical personality and socio-professional suitability was compiled when the children left the station. This report went either to the parents or to the state institution to which the children were subsequently assigned. So the gaze into the children's lives continued even after they were released. The defectologists argued that the former users of their facilities still needed moral and material support in taking any independent step. So archival records reveal that doctors and pedagogues often attempted to stay in touch with their former pupils, students. So surveillance. But then there was also a strongly disciplining dimension of the children's everyday schedules. And that could have been another source of unhappiness for Nastya. The defectologists offered to their young clients a rational and hygienic sanatorium regime, which entailed a precisely elaborated system of therapeutic pedagogical interventions. So the typical day started at 9 in the morning. The children woke up, they washed themselves, they cleaned their rooms, they drank tea. Until 10, they stayed under the care of a tutor. Afterwards, they were passed on to the head teacher, who read with them, carried out conversations with them. At 2 in the afternoon, the children had lunch, and then spent the rest of the day in the courtyard. They were resting, they were playing under the supervision of a tutor. In the evenings, from 6 to 8, they worked again with the teacher. At 8, they had dinner. At 9, they went to sleep. Unbalanced and nervous children which had unstable personalities were believed to receive crucial help from this unchanging regime of life, so a lot of reglementation. Morally defective boys and girls played games, they participated in storytelling, in reading activities, they went out for excursions, they watched performances, attended art and music classes, they took singing lessons, and they did a lot of physical exercise. The Soviet defectologists assigned great importance to physical education. Overexertion, on the other hand, was considered harmful for defective children. Physical labor was not supposed to be grueling. Rest and sleep were essential. So after lunch, the children took a nap, and the duration of the night's sleep was longer than for normal, so-called normal children of the same age group. The relative proportion of work time and free time was measured precisely. Strict control was applied to the balance between intellectual and muscular physical activities. So prolonged sleep, alteration of work and rest, open air play for 4 to 5 hours a day, sufficient space in the lodgings, extra caloric nutrition by the standards of the time. All this was part of what the defectologists called physical and psychic hygiene. It facilitated the development of the child's nervous system. It acted almost like a chemical formula that changed the pernicious influences of the unhygienic surrounding environments. So this description I just gave to you of the medico-pedagogical station reveals the invasiveness of the defectologist's practice of help. Identical methods were used in the Pierre Psychoneurological School Sanatorium and other defectological facilities of the time. This, of course, triggers our empathy for the sad girl Nastya, for the morally defective boys who tried to run away. Still, we should consider that the lives of Soviet children diagnosed with moral defectiveness and put in these institutions were not so grim in comparison with those of the many other Soviet children living on the streets or living in labor colonies managed by the Commissariat of Internal Affairs. In the defectological homes, the intrusiveness of the experts' diagnostic and educational methods, their disciplines, their normalizing goals, were mitigated by truly inclusive and humane aspirations. The defectologists always insisted that no child is to be locked in a punitive institution. The facilities for morally defective children should neither be prisons nor factories, but simply children's home, relief institution with didactic educational purposes. isolation rooms, and other prison-like forms of punishment horrified Kashenko. He called them unfounded and cruel, monstrous, anti-pedagogical educational measures. Contemporary admirers of defectology in the 1920s and 30s praised this discipline for having, quote, the marvelous simplicity of an authentic scientific thought in which accurate observations combined with attention and love towards difficult children. The child psychiatrist Tatiana Simpson reminded educators working with out-of-mainstream boys and girls to take into account these children's stronger need for love, give them attention and affection in greater measure than to their so-called normal peers. Similarly, Putnin argued that one of the most important methods to discipline morally defective children was to establish an emotional connection between the child and the pedagogue. The pedagogue had to gain the child's trust by using a sensitive approach, an attentive approach. Kashenko and Murashov wrote, "There is no education without heart, without love and care for the child." Thus, while scientific knowledge was crucial, it could lead to the correction of children's defects, their rebirth into a socially useful life only when combined with heartfelt, loving attitude. This was an integrative goal. To achieve that, the defectologists believed it fundamental to provide children not only with general education, but also with working skills. Kashenko argued that through labor, abnormal children cease to be invalids, this is a quote. They are joined to the socially useful and creative work of the Soviet people building the communist society. While the facilities for moral defective children should not be places where the children become soulless gears of a huge mechanism, they should diverge also from old-style shelters where spiritually demoralized children dissipated the financial resources assigned to them. The Soviet homes were to be humane and rational investments in the future. The children had to be educated in the spirit of conscientious work, respect for themselves and others, faith in the future and in their strong young energies. Remember, those are the 1920s and early 1930s. There is still a lot of optimism for this, a lot of look into the future. The defectologists' attempt to combine labor with children's self-confidence, personal motivation, and other positive emotion was certainly directed at creating future productive subjects who could join the hard work of building communism. However, the desire to inspire creative joy and feelings of self-worth was very important. It revealed attention to these children's well-being. And this cannot be completely subsumed under productivist motives. Kashenko once stated, children's joy and laughter are so precious that any children's institution should encourage and protect them like the pupil of the eye. The defectologists look for didactic materials that might appeal to children's interest. They sought to provide their wards with diverse experiences. They believed that the joy that the children would feel could improve their whole psyche. For instance, after admitting a boy who didn't show absolutely any interest in anything, the defectologists observed and studied him for some months. They watched keenly for signs of his better nature. And one day, during a visit to a museum, they noticed that the child was curious about hieroglyphics. The defectologists built their didactic program around this first manifestation of interest. And soon the child's apathy disappeared. Within 1 year, he turned into a talented historian, as the defectologist said. So each morally defective child was to be normalized, but without dragging him forcefully by the ears to fit into the norm. As the defectology Kiselyov recommended, in the Soviet establishments for morally defective children, the correction of individual personalities should not happen by ironing out children's distinguishing traits, but rather by looking for ways to make individual characteristics perform useful work for the rest of society. In this respect, defectology was strongly different from Anton Makarenko's methods of re-education, with which you might be familiar. For Makarenko, the cultivation of a sense of collectivity, even through the use of coercion, was the exclusive strategy to reform the individual. Makarenko did wish his colonists to be happy, but true human joy for him could rest only in the collective and in children's sense of duty towards the collective. For the defectologist, instead, a non-coercive, individualized education based on personal interest was not in contradiction with the goal to develop a collective habit, a social ideal in antisocial children. Simpson, the child psychiatrist that I already mentioned, wrote that, no, sorry, I went too far. Let me go back. Yes, so she wrote that in the process of work in a collective, the child must believe that he can realize his self in a positive sense. So in a rationally organized and scrupulously planned, but also loving environment, each deviant child could find the best field to work on the defective forms of their behavior. Everything in the medico-pedagogical station, from the pavilion living arrangements to the classroom work, the recreational activities, everything was oriented towards helping the individual child while also forging him into an upright member of the communist collective. The defectologist's use of art is another telling example of how an approach both scientific and humane ought to facilitate the emergence of social emotions without denying the individual. Kashenko contended that music, dance, and theater capture all of us and compel us to experience collective emotion. They draw people together like the members of one family. They put them in unison. Experiences such as singing or reciting poems all together were the ground for bringing individual children closer to the collective. Indeed, for the defectologist, art education was not supposed to breed passive aesthetes, but rather raise full-fledged members of the communist society, fighters for its ideals. Again, to understand the specificity of the defectologist's approach to art, it can be useful to quote Makarenko and his different approach to art. This is what Makarenko wrote. Theater was not our enjoyment or hobby, but our duty, an inevitable social contribution. From the point of view of the colony's interest, it was indifferent what part one or another colonist took in the play. He was supposed to do what he was required to do. So you see, it's a more coercive approach. Kashenko instead praised art as the manifestation of children's individual creativity and taste. Artistic endeavors were valuable for the defectologist precisely because they gave space to individual vocation. But at the same time, they provided children's labor with significance. Art prevented abnormal children from developing feelings of unworthiness. This approach is yet another indication that defectology's ultimate goal was not to exclude social degenerates, but to adapt problematic personalities to the socialist living environment. In their practice of help, re-education happened for the sake of both the individual and the collective. Finally, the limits and the inner moral tensions of this practice of help that was supposed to be simultaneously pleasurable and collective, individualized and socially useful, are evident in the story of the Pushkino summer camp. The Pushkino summer camp was established in 1926 in a village in the Moscow hinterland. It was a facility meant to be a site where enjoyable activities such as playing outdoor games, going for long walks, swimming, rowing, working in the vegetable garden, cultivating flowers, all these enjoyable activities were supposed to correct behaviorally deviant children. Unlike the medico-pedagogical station, the Pushkino camp was also a space where educational work was imbued with the social goal of serving the rural population. By having morally defective children read aloud to the peasants, illiterate peasants, or help rural nannies care for small babies, rural mothers care for small babies, the defectologists became implicated in the Soviet government's massive campaign to transform the backward Russian peasantry. Difficult children left the urban defectological facilities. They went into the countryside to perform work for themselves and for the collective. So no longer punished, no longer isolated from life, these non-conforming youth were now closely connected to the new socialist life. At the same time, this process subtly reversed the directionality of Soviet help. It was no longer the children who received help, or not only the children who received help, but these poor and suffering children became of great help to the countryside and the state itself. Let me now proceed to the second story and example I want to tell you about today. A very different time period. We are here in the 1960s and 1970s. And I want to talk about the debates, international debates, in which Soviet special education teachers and blind activists were involved about the meaning of integration. So the late 1960s were a time of profound change in global disability politics. A new orientation coming from the United States called for deinstitutionalization, community care. It campaigned for disabled people's rights to live independently and enter the country's regular educational systems and labor markets. These issues were heatedly debated at the conferences organized by an international organization called World Council for the Welfare of the Blind. And the Soviet Union belonged to this world organization too. At those conferences, the All-Russian Society of the Blind, the Всероссийское общество слепых, or VOS, VOS was praised by international activists for its focus on blind people's employment, on blind people's social rights, and emancipation from the chains of philanthropy. But some doubts were also voiced about Soviet practices of sheltered employment, concentrated housing, and separated education. It is on those debates that I want to focus now. In the picture here, you see attendees at an international symposium on vocational rehabilitation that took place in Berlin in May 1967. That was just 1 month after the Soviet Union and the GDR had joined the World Organization, the World Council for the Blind. It was the first occasion that the Western and Eastern activists came together and tested their differences. This event was a celebration of unity, a celebration of a shared commitment to social progress. Attendees discovered to have much in common. First, they all emphasized the dangers of blind people's isolation, the danger of isolation and alienation from society. They argued that the main goal of their work was integration and complete equality. Second, they saw the onset of blindness not only as a problem of optical perception, but also as psychological shock. And they unanimously identify rehabilitation as the process by which blind people overcome helplessness, overcome dependency, inferiority, and ultimately can find their place in society. Third, as a common feature, both capitalism and socialism were productivity regimes. When activists discussed the best ways to achieve equal footing with the sighted, they all agreed on the importance of labor. The old philanthropic model of care that was embraced by blind organizations of Western Europe until World War II or thereafter had now lost all attraction. In Berlin, Western activists praised the socialist countries for having advanced a labor-based approach to blind people's problems. They were very pleased to share experiences with them. However, blind activists at this conference also began to voice competing position in relation to special education. All throughout the socialist camp, blind and low-sighted children were offered a general education program that lasted from 8 to 11 years and purported to be the same as the curriculum of regular schools, while also providing specialized vocational training. In theory, the system qualified blind pupils for admission to higher education together with sighted graduates. West European visitors to the Soviet Union were impressed by the educational setup. At the same time, however, they were also receptive to the new American trends that advocated for co-education of disabled and able-bodied children. Activist debates on school integration offer a unique glimpse into a fluid moment in the history of disability, when mainstreaming ideas were gaining momentum, but governments had not yet passed laws on this issue. School integration was not yet an absolute indicator of social progress. Indeed, blind activist opinions on this ran the full gamut and sometimes crisscrossed Cold War boundaries. So at the head of those who argued for integrated education was the American Jean Kinmore. She was the director of the American Foundation for Overseas Blind. In the paper that she presented at a conference in 1972, Kenmore recognized that blind children have special needs that must be met if they are to receive education anywhere. But she also sustained that it was possible to meet these needs through planned programs of integration. Again, the term used at that time was integration. In her opinion, with well-trained instructors in mobility and independence skills, with adequate specialized aids, blind children could be taught in mainstream schools and successfully compete with the sighted. Citing examples of optimal integrated education from different countries, Kenmore praised the many virtues of her inclusive approach, recommended cooperation between traditional special schools and new mainstreaming programs that would prepare blind pupils for an independent life in their community. Ultimately, for Kenmore, integrated education was to be preferred because it changed sighted people's understanding about the normalcy of the child. So this is what she wrote. We must give sighted children the opportunities of living, studying, and playing with blind children. So it is, she says, it is the sighted child that must be given that opportunity. This is the beginning of the inclusive approach. Research has shown what extremely different attitudes sighted children develop of the blind after having attended school with them. Several activists in the World Council shared Kenmore's views. The Dutch Peter Ziebrand-Oost believed that schools specifically targeted at the blind promoted only isolation. This is what he wrote. A child who attends a special school remains imprisoned in special education. The horizons of his thinking do not expand but shrink. Oost even rejected the use of pedagogical blind aids for low-sighted children because, in his opinion, they didn't help include the pupil in normal societal relation. On the contrary, he believed that aids contributed to position the child outside the sphere of the normal. Yugoslav blind teacher Nada Zaric and West German activist Horst Geisler also preferred inclusive education over the seclusion of the Soviet residential schools. Because mainstreaming, they said, helped the blind child grow into the world of the sighted from the very onset. For the Finnish Lena Erkila, blind children could be brought up successfully in inclusive institutions even at the preschool level, provided the proper instruction was given to the teachers. In a 1977 paper, in a paper she gave in a 1977 symposium, she said, participation in a play group with sighted children is necessary to be put in the condition to reach sufficient maturity in social, physical, and cognitive terms and integrate in the school community with sighted peers. So all these people that I just quoted strongly were for, they believed in co-education. Other activists, however, were opposed to mainstreaming. The British Michael Tobin believed that compensatory education could only be implemented within a system of separate facilities. The French Henri Gauvry and the Austrian Friedrich Benesch cautiously weighed the advantages and disadvantages of segregated versus inclusive education. On the one hand, education in blind-only institutions led to a rigid separation from the outside world, but also provided a protected environment in which blind youth could strengthen their will in a very fragile phase of their lives. On the other hand, while integrated education gave more freedom of choice, it also meant disregard for pupil-specific problems, which could lead to a profound sense of disorientation. Voss, Всероссийское общество слепых, defended the preeminence of its system of spatial boarding schools. Indeed, in the interwar period, a few Soviet defectologists, such as Vladimir Gandir, had opposed the creation of specialized educational institutes for the blind that argued that the blind could study together with the sighted on equal terms. But by the mid-1950s, the issue of separate education was no longer debated among those activists. A system was set up that was for separate education. Conference upon conference, the Soviet TEFL pedagogues explained to Western activists that boarding institutions were not intended to isolate blind children from their sighted peers. Rather, they were supposed to create more advantageous medical and pedagogical conditions for the education of children in line with the defectological theories of compensation. These theories emphasize the differences between defective and normal children, and in clear opposition to what the Dutch host proposed, require special technologies to compensate for the deficiencies of the blind. Activists across the socialist bloc shared the faith in defectology and its correctional, transformational medical approach. For instance, the East German Wolfgang Fromm and Gerhard Henk argued that separate institutions were crucial for blind children to reduce their defects to the minimum, develop their performing capacities to comparable levels with their sighted peers, and thereby adapt themselves to society. These pertain to daycares too, where defectologically trained personnel help blind toddlers fit into society, conform to society. In the opinion of blind activists and sighted experts from Eastern Germany, only separate schools could teach blind-specific content, such as the training of the senses, space tracking, the use of blind aids and prosthetic devices. At the same time, the socialist institutions avoided what was called hospitalism and segregation through apprenticeship contracts with state enterprises and the inclusion of blind youth in the practice of socialist competitions together with sighted pupils. With this approach, the East German Fromm insisted, visually impaired children learn to fight their way, learn to fight their way in the world of the sighted and become their equal partners in the economic and cultural spheres. I want to show you a quote from another East German blind activist, Hartmut Mehls, who articulated this idea through a simple but sagacious metaphor. How many non-swimmers become truly good swimmers by simply throwing them in the water? So for socialist activists, blind-specific education in separate spaces was the condition that made blind children fit for landing a remunerable job, demonstrating their competency, eventually earning equality with the sighted. While motivated by good intentions, this approach implied that the special education fixed inherent deficiency and allowed the blind children to achieve integration rather than inclusion, only if they turned into the same as the sighted or even better. For Western activists too, the demonstration of competence was the sole means of mitigating widespread prejudices, of emancipating blind children from the shackles of charity. They too urged blind people to conform to their non-disabled counterparts by overcoming disability, performing as though their impairment didn't exist. The shared compulsion to perform, however, manifested itself in different ways in the capitalist and socialist orders. In the face of a precarious labor market, Western art activists argued that marginalization could be undone by increasing their constituencies' competitiveness. In fact, they claimed that the right to compete in the regular economy achieved justice for blind people. Soviet and other socialist activists instead drew Marxist-Leninist notions of labor as a means of economic maintenance and a source of moral satisfaction and happiness. While they celebrated their governments for guaranteeing the right to work to all citizens, they also implicitly acknowledged the ableism of an industrial economy in very cynical ways, maybe more cynical ways than their Western counterparts. And the problem was that blind people's supposedly inherent defects made transformation into normality possible only in segregated spaces, spaces that ran parallel to the world of the sighted. For the blind activists of VOS, the prominence of productivity led to an unmitigated insistence on overcoming that not only postponed integration to an undetermined future, but also obscured individual psychological experiences of blindness, especially those of blind children who didn't perform according to ideal standards. So instead of harnessing the winds of change that they were blowing in global disability politics, Soviet blind activists proclaimed that VOS would never change its path. It would never adapt to Western suggestions. Indeed, Soviet activists kept their educational systems unchanged throughout the 1970s and 80s. Why? Why did they miss the opportunity? Well, VOS activists believed that integrated schools were unfeasible in their political and economic context because the price tag that they carried was too high. Successful inclusion, where blind persons could enroll in standard education curricula and make effective use of them, required considerable expenses. You need to make Braille and audio text widely available. You need to increase the use of sensory aids, provide supportive services such as mobility training, communication skills. Even more crucially, perhaps, inclusive education demanded the administrative support of the Ministry of Education and Soviet teachers themselves. VOS activists were cognizant that these conditions could hardly be achieved in the Soviet Union of the 70s and 80s. Furthermore, we should not exclude or we should not ignore blind people's real desires for separate spaces. Disabled people can find experiences of inclusion and belonging with supposedly marginal environments, for instance, segregated education. They might find it somehow good for the affirmation of their identity. On the other hand, they might struggle with marginalization in places that are more inclusive, such as mainstream education. Some disability scholars have proposed to resist the static classification of educational spaces as either inclusive or exclusionary. They propose to recognize the way that spaces are inhabited depends on the context, depends on the relational networks. And it is these contexts and networks that determine whether a space is inclusive or exclusive. Traces of disabled people wish for separate spaces have emerged in the interviews that my colleague Cassandra Hartblay took with wheelchair users in Russia in the early 1910s. Polish scholar Natalia Pamula identified positive attachments to separate spaces in Polish fiction of the 1970s and 80s. In this fiction, blind protagonists embrace the division between blind and sighted that is made possible through employment in shelter workshop, and they find in it a means of identity affirmation. And British scholar Claire Shaw has suggested to interpret the specialized enterprises run by deaf people and other separate institutions of Всероссийское общество глухих, not only as segregated spaces, but also as spaces for the assertion of a positive Soviet deafness. Similarly, residential schools might have fulfilled the need of some blind children for an insulated and alternative world. They reveal the complex meaning of institutions that could be vehicles of agency as well as instruments of marginalization. So, in conclusion, with the two examples that I presented to you today, the one about defectological care for morally defective children in the 20s, and the one about these international debates over blind children's education in the 60s, I have hopefully shown to you that inclusion is not a post-1991 novelty adopted exclusively from Western theories and practices of special education. In Soviet times, it was called integration. Certainly, it put the burden to change and integrate on disabled people rather than on society. And yet it was a concept, it was a practice, it was an aspiration with its own history. It was debated over, it was experimented with, and it was fought for by various agents, not only medical and educational experts, but blind people themselves and disabled people themselves. Thank you for your attention.
Если в зале есть вопросы, можно поднять руку.
If there are any questions, please raise your hand and I will give you the mic. The questions can be given in both in Russian and English, and I will try to answer in Russian. Is my Russian understandable? Yes, your Russian is very good. Perfect. But I will give the question in English.
It's a pleasure to be here and to hear your lecture. My name is Mir Said. I am a researcher and I'm working at this library. And as you see, I'm a person with visual disabilities, and I am researching in this sphere for 4 years because I am a lawyer and I protect the rights of people with disabilities. And I would like to ask about the model of using, of understanding the disability. What do you think, which model of understanding disability used in Soviet Union? Because I think that the more privilege was to the medical model of understanding the disability. As you know, we have 3 typical models: philanthropic model, medical and social model of understanding the disability of using. And what do you think, which model was in privilege in Soviet Union? Because I think from your lecture, they used more the medical understanding of disability. And I think they tried to recure and to help, but not integrate them to the society. And what do you think about it?
Thank you so much for this question. This is a great question. Elsewhere in my publications, I have argued for a different model from the 3 you mentioned that I call the socialist model. And let me explain why. So the socialist model was something unique to the socialist ideological system and practice of life. It had some features of the medical model, whereby people with disabilities have to be corrected, fixed, changed. They have to overcome their defects, and they have to be made into, to be transformed into something better that fits society. Definitely, you are absolutely correct. This was important for the Soviet model. However, what I call the socialist model of disability also strongly believed the society in which people live influences their lives. And they also strongly believed that it was through changes in laws, in environments, and I'm not talking about built structure here, unfortunately, but I'm talking more about opportunities of employment, welfare, medical services that are accessible. So the system believed, the socialist model believed that society and the state in particular needs to provide conditions for the disabled to be changed, fixed, to overcome their defects. So it was, of course, there was an ideological component there, right, that has a lot to do. So for instance, the socialist model claimed that capitalism cannot possibly provide the necessary conditions for people with disabilities to live better lives. That was the ideological component. But what matters here is that while the medical model is absolutely obsessed only with the person and the defects and the pathologies of the person, the socialist model did understand that different social conditions make a difference in the lives of people with disabilities. Now, there were, of course, limitations to this. Investment was never made into changing the built environment. So people with mobility impairments were particularly isolated because they required investments and real concrete interventions, while people with sensory disabilities, such as deafness or blindness, in some respects require less intervention, less investment in changing the built environment. So for people with sensory disabilities, the state could provide more opportunities for education, for work, although in sheltered collectives. So I'm not praising here this model. I recognize its limitations very well, but it did understand the importance of social conditions and environmental conditions for the well-being of people with disabilities, which the classic medical model does not provide for. Also, the medical model comes from previous religious models and is very strongly associated with philanthropic and charitable, right, with charity. While the socialist model absolutely despised charity because charity created dependency, it didn't create self-worth, which were features very important for Soviet special education experts and defectologists. I hope I answered your question with this.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Работает?
There is a question. Mir Said, I want to say that I completely agree with your opinion because I am audibly impaired myself. And I have the specific medical direction. And I think that the audio impairity, the hearing impairity, should be corrected, as the defectologist says. And truly, the deaf people, they cannot be treated. They cannot be completely treated. This is a more specific question. And it's related to the special needs of the visually, audibly impaired. We are pretty much the same. We say that we need to teach such people, but we really forget that the audibly impaired people have specific problems. They take everything from the sign language. At the next lecture, there will be the talk about this. Thank you for your questions and the comments. Dear friends, thank you very much for your questions. And thank you. We are grateful to Ekaterina for her comment. She made like the announcement of her next lecture. I think with this we can complete our first lecture. Now I invite you to coffee break, which will take place at the courtyard of the library. And after we will start the next block.